Thomas Wade stood at the fence line, squinting at the horizon where heat turned the air into liquid glass. 3 months without rain. The land had gone from brown to gray to something closer to ash. Cattle bones marked the dried creek beds like tombstones. He'd watched his neighbors pack up and leave, one by one. The Hendersons went first, then the Morales family, then old Dutch Werner, who swore he'd die on his land. Dutch made it 2 weeks after that promise before his son came and carried him off to Santa Fe. Now Thomas was the last one, just him, his ranch hand Pete, and a herd that shrank every day. The bankman had come last Tuesday, young fellow with clean hands and a leather folder full of papers. He'd sat in Thomas's kitchen, apologizing with his mouth while his eyes did math on everything Thomas owned. 2 weeks, that's what the papers said. 2 weeks to produce money that didn't exist, or the ranch went to auction. Thomas had signed his name and watched the banker ride away. No point arguing with paper. His wife Ellen would have known what to say. She always did. But Ellen had been gone 2 years now, buried on the hill overlooking the valley she'd loved. Some days Thomas talked to her up there. Mostly he just sat quiet, figuring she already knew what he was thinking anyway. Pete was fixing fence posts that didn't matter anymore when Thomas saw the rider. Noon sun, the worst time for seeing straight. He blinked hard, thinking it was another ghost his mind was painting on the emptiness. But the horse was real. The rider was real. A woman, slumped forward in the saddle like she might slide off any second. Dust covered her so thick Thomas couldn't tell what color her clothes had been. Dark hair stuck to her face. She reached the fence and stopped. Didn't call out, didn't wave, just sat there, swaying slightly, looking at him. Thomas had 1 canteen left. He'd been rationing it, making it last. The well was nearly dry. Every drop mattered now. He picked up the canteen anyway and walked out to the fence. Up close, he could see her better. Maybe 30 years old. Clothes that looked like they'd been military once, but not U.S. cavalry. Something else. Her eyes tracked him, but she didn't speak. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Thomas held up the canteen. She took it with both hands, like it might disappear if she wasn't careful. Drank half, stopped herself, handed it back. He shook his head. Keep it. She drank the rest, slow, deliberate. When she finished, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, turned her horse, and rode east toward the mesa. Pete walked up beside Thomas, watching her go. That was our last water. I know. We got nothing left now. Thomas watched the rider disappear into the heat shimmer. Reckon we didn't have much before. Pete spat dust. Why'd you do it? Thomas didn't answer because he didn't have one. Something about the way she'd sat there, not begging, not demanding, just existing in her need. Maybe that was enough. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Thomas sat on the porch Ellen had loved, watching darkness settle over land that wouldn't be his much longer. 2 weeks, might as well be 2 days. He'd already made peace with losing. Sometimes you fight until your arms give out. Then you just stand there and let the end come. The stars were sharp and cold. No clouds, no promise of rain. Just empty sky over empty land. He thought about the woman riding toward the mesa. Apache territory, or what used to be before the treaties and the wars and the slow grinding down of everything. Nobody went out there now. Nothing out there but rocks and ghosts. Thomas wondered if she'd made it. Wondered why she'd been alone. Wondered why he cared. The wind picked up, carrying dust that tasted like defeat. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Another answered. The land was dying, but it wasn't dead yet. Still had enough life in it for scavengers. He stood up, joints creaking, 53 years old, and feeling every one of them. Tomorrow would be another day of watching cattle die and water disappear, another day closer to the end. But tonight, He'd given his last water to a stranger, for no reason except it seemed like the thing to do. Ellen would have understood that. She always said the measure of a man wasn't what he kept, but what he gave when he had nothing left to give. Thomas went inside. Tomorrow the sun would rise and burn and nothing would change. 2 weeks until the bank came. 2 weeks until everything his wife had loved became someone else's problem. He lay down in the dark and closed his eyes. Before we proceed, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. The next day passed like all the others. Hot, dry, hopeless. Thomas and Pete tried to move the cattle closer to the one water source, still trickling from the north pasture. They lost another cow to the heat before noon, the animal collapsing mid-step like its legs just forgot how to work. Pete dragged the carcass away from the others while Thomas watched buzzards circle overhead, patient as death itself. By afternoon, Thomas had stopped counting losses. The numbers didn't matter anymore. 2 weeks until the bank came. 2 weeks until he signed whatever papers they put in front of him and walked away from the only thing he'd ever built. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at nothing when Pete's voice cut through the heat. "Boss, we got company." Thomas looked up. Pete was standing by the fence, one hand shading his eyes, the other pointing east toward the mesa. Thomas stood slowly, joints protesting, and squinted into the glare. Riders on the horizon, not a few, dozens. His first thought was raid. His second thought was that he didn't have anything left worth raiding. He grabbed his rifle anyway, muscle memory from years when this land actually mattered, and walked out to meet whatever was coming. As they got closer, Thomas recognized the woman from yesterday. Same dark hair, same military clothes that didn't match any uniform he knew. She rode at the front of the group, 40 or more people behind her, all armed, all watching him with eyes that had seen too much. They stopped at his fence line. The woman dismounted and walked forward alone. Pete raised his rifle. Thomas put a hand on the barrel and pushed it down. The woman stopped 10 feet away. When she spoke, her voice came out rough, like she didn't use it often and had to remember how. "My name is Sarah Bridger." Thomas waited. "These are my people. We've been hiding in the mesa for 5 years, running from a man named Colonel Vance who wants us dead for knowing what he did." She paused, looked back at the riders, then at Thomas. "Your water saved my life yesterday. I was scouting, 3 days without drink, about an hour from dying when I reached your fence, so I'm here to pay the debt." Thomas looked at the 40-some people behind her. Families, he realized, not just fighters. Children holding onto saddles, women with rifles across their laps, men with faces carved hard by years of running. "I don't need an army," Thomas said. "I need rain." "Can't bring rain." Sarah's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "But I know where Colonel Vance keeps the money he stole from the territorial government. $50,000 meant for drought relief that never came to people like you. He's camped 30 miles south with 12 men, heading north to finish what he started with us." Thomas shook his head. "Don't see what that has to do with me. Vance will come through your ranch in 2 days, straight through this property on his way north." Sarah took a step closer. "Help us set the trap here, and we split the recovered money. Enough to save your ranch 10 times over." She let that sit for a moment. "But it means turning your land into a battlefield." Pete made a noise in his throat. Thomas didn't look at him. "You're asking me to start a war on my own property. I'm asking you to help finish one that's been going for 5 years. Sarah's eyes didn't leave his. "Vance burned a town in Texas because people witnessed him stealing government funds. Killed anyone who could testify. We ran. Been running ever since, losing people one by one." She gestured at the riders behind her. "These folks are tired of running. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even if the ground isn't yours. Thomas thought about his wife, buried on the hill behind the house, thought about the bank papers sitting on his kitchen table, thought about the fact that he'd already lost everything that mattered. So what did he have left to risk? How much time do we have? 1 day to prepare. He'll come at dawn the day after tomorrow. Pete stepped forward. Boss, this is crazy. Thomas looked at his ranch hand, then at Sarah, then at the 40 people who'd followed her here on the word of a woman who'd shared a canteen with a stranger. Yeah, Thomas said. It probably is. He lowered his rifle. But I'm in. Thomas stood in his kitchen that night, staring at the empty canteen on the table. The woman's words kept circling through his head. Colonel Vance, stolen money, a battlefield on his land. He'd given her water without thinking, and now 40 armed strangers were camped around his property, preparing to ambush a man he'd never met. Pete walked in, his face tight with worry. This is crazy, Tom. We're ranchers, not soldiers. Thomas picked up the canteen, felt its weight. We're dead men if we do nothing. Bank takes this place in 2 weeks anyway. Better broke than buried. Maybe. Thomas set the canteen down. But Sarah's people looked me in the eye, Pete. They're not outlaws. They're running from something worse than drought. Pete sat down hard in the chair. So, we're really doing this. We're really doing this. The preparations started before dawn. Sarah divided her people into groups. 10 went to the barn with rifles, finding positions in the hayloft and behind the reinforced doors. 15 more spread out along the ravine on the east side, hidden by brush and rocks. The rest took positions around the main house and the fence line. Thomas watched them work. They moved quietly, efficiently, like they'd done this before. Sarah walked the property with 2 of her scouts, marking sight lines and escape routes. She stopped at the well, looked down into the dry shaft. How long since it gave water? She asked. 6 weeks. Thomas kicked a stone into the darkness. Used to be strong. Now it's just a hole in the ground. Sarah nodded. Vance does that. Takes what's flowing and leaves dust behind. One of her men brought out the weapons they'd been carrying. Thomas saw military rifles, old cavalry pistols, even a shotgun that looked like it survived the war. These weren't bandits playing dress-up. These were fighters who'd learned the hard way. Where'd you get all this? Thomas asked. Took it off men who didn't need it anymore, Sarah said. Her voice carried no pride, just fact. By midday, the positions were set. Sarah gathered everyone in the barn. Thomas and Pete stood at the back, listening. Vance moves fast in the morning, Sarah said. He likes to cover ground before the heat sets in. He'll have 12 men, maybe 13. They'll see the ranch and think it's empty or easy. That's when we show them different. One of her people, a young man with a scar across his jaw, spoke up. What if he sends scouts ahead? Then we take them quiet and keep moving. The goal is Vance and that wagon. Everything else is just noise. Thomas felt his heartbeat pick up. This was real. Tomorrow morning, men would ride onto his land planning to pass through, and instead they'd find a fight they never expected. That afternoon, Thomas and Pete moved everything valuable into the root cellar. The few family items Thomas had left from his wife, the deed to the property, a photograph of his parents. If the ranch burned tomorrow, at least something would survive. Sarah found him as the sun started dropping. She carried 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. They stood by the fence where he'd given her the water yesterday. You didn't have to say yes, she said. Didn't have much choice. There's always a choice. Sarah drank her coffee, eyes on the horizon. You could have told us to ride on. Most men would have. Thomas thought about that. My wife used to say the land remembers kindness. I never understood what she meant until she was gone. Maybe I'm just trying to prove she was right. She was. Sarah finished her coffee. "You'll see tomorrow." Night fell over the ranch. 40 people tried to sleep in shifts, weapons close, ears tuned to every sound. Thomas lay in his bed but didn't close his eyes. He thought about his wife, about the years they'd spent building this place from nothing. She'd wanted children, but they never came. She'd wanted rain, but the drought took her before it broke. Now her peaceful ranch would see blood. Thomas got up around midnight, walked outside. The stars were sharp and cold overhead. Pete sat on the porch steps cleaning his rifle. "Can't sleep either?" Pete asked. "No." Thomas sat down beside him. "You can still leave, you know. Ride out before dawn. This isn't your fight." Pete worked the cleaning rod through the barrel. "Been working this ranch for 8 years, Tom. Ate at your table, buried your wife beside you. If it's your fight, it's mine." Thomas didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. Sarah appeared from the barn, checking positions one last time. She saw Thomas and Pete on the porch, raised a hand. They raised theirs back. The night passed slowly. Then the eastern sky started turning gray. Dawn was coming, and with it, Colonel Vance. Thomas watched the dust rise on the horizon. His hands were steady on the porch railing, but his chest felt tight. This was it. No turning back now. Vance's group came into view as the sun broke over the eastern hills. 12 riders, just like Sarah said, one wagon rolling behind them, covered with canvas. The colonel rode at the front, easy in his saddle, like a man who'd never met real resistance. Thomas forced himself to breathe normal. He was the bait. The first thing Vance would see, an old rancher on a dying property, alone and harmless. Except he wasn't alone. Sarah and her people were hidden in positions they'd spent all night perfecting. 10 in the barn loft with rifles, 15 in the ravine to the east, another 10 behind the rocks near the water tower, 5 more inside the house, covering the windows. Thomas couldn't see any of them. That was the point. Pete was in the barn, shoulder bandaged from where he'd cut it yesterday moving barrels. He'd wanted to stand on the porch with Thomas, but Sarah said no. 1 man looked like bad luck. 2 men looked like a trap. Vance's group slowed as they approached the fence line. The colonel raised his hand, and his men stopped. He rode forward alone, eyes scanning the property. Thomas could see him now. Big shoulders, gray beard, a hat with colonel's insignia that probably came off a dead Union officer. "Morning," Vance called out. His voice was rough but friendly, the kind of friendly that made Thomas think of snakes. "Morning," Thomas said back. Vance walked his horse closer to the fence. "Name's Colonel Vance. We're passing through on territorial business. You seen any trouble around here? Apache, maybe? Outlaws?" Thomas shook his head. "Just drought and dying cattle." Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hard times for everyone. Mind if my men water their horses? We've been riding since midnight." "Water's low," Thomas said, "but I got enough for horses." That was the signal. Vance would bring his men in close, thinking he was dealing with a desperate rancher who couldn't say no. Vance turned in his saddle and waved his men forward. They came through the fence line in a loose group, relaxed, talking among themselves. The wagon creaked behind them, driver half asleep on the bench. Thomas stepped off the porch and walked toward the water trough near the barn. His legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. Vance followed him, still mounted. The other riders spread out across the yard, looking around with the casual arrogance of men who'd never been challenged. One of them, a thin man with a scar on his neck, peered at the barn. "Place looks empty." "It is," Thomas said. "Just me and 1 hand. He's out checking fence line." The lie came easy. Thomas surprised himself. Vance dismounted near the trough. He was taller than Thomas expected, built like a man who'd done hard work before he started stealing. You make it through this drought, you'll be the only rancher left in 50 miles. That's what the bank says. Bank. Vance spat in the dust. Banks don't care about men like us. They just want their money. Thomas almost laughed. This man talking about banks like he was a victim while $50,000 in drought relief sat in his wagon 20 feet away. Vance's men started leading their horses to the trough. They bunched up, exactly like Sarah said they would. Men get careless around water. Sarah's voice cut across the yard like a rifle shot. Nobody move. 40 people appeared at once, rifles from the barn loft, figures rising from the ravine, guns in every window of the house. The rocks near the water tower suddenly had people behind them. Vance's men froze. A few reached for their weapons, then stopped when they saw the odds. Vance himself didn't move. He looked at Thomas with something like respect. "You're smarter than you look, old man." "I had help," Thomas said. Sarah walked out from the barn, rifle aimed at Vance's chest. Her people moved in from all sides, keeping their weapons steady. Thomas recognized the discipline. These weren't amateurs. "Colonel Vance," Sarah said. "Been looking for you for 5 years." Vance's face changed. Recognition, then anger. "Sarah Bridger, thought you died in Texas. You thought wrong." "This is a mistake," Vance said. His hand drifted toward his hip. Sarah's rifle didn't waver. "The only mistake was yours, thinking you could steal government money and burn a town to hide it, thinking no one would come for you. You got no proof. We got your wagon, we got witnesses, and we got the territorial marshal riding in tomorrow morning with deputies." That's when Vance went for his gun. Thomas Wade stood on his porch as the first light touched the eastern hills. His rifle leaned against the rail, loaded and ready. Pete crouched behind the water trough to his right, hat pulled low. The ranch looked empty, quiet, like any other morning. That was the point. Sarah and her people were invisible. 10 in the barn loft, 15 in the ravine east of the house, another 10 behind the rocks near the north fence. The rest waited in the root cellar with the horses, ready to cut off any retreat. Thomas could feel them out there, 40 people holding their breath, waiting for 12 men who had no idea what was coming. The sun climbed higher. Thomas's mouth went dry. He wanted to reach for his canteen, but didn't move. Any motion might catch the wrong eye at the wrong time. Then he saw the dust. A line of riders appeared on the southern trail, moving steady toward the ranch. Thomas counted them as they got closer. 12 horses, 1 wagon in the middle. The man at the front sat tall in his saddle, wearing a colonel's hat that caught the early light. Vance. Thomas felt his hands start to shake. He pressed them flat against his legs until they stopped. Pete glanced over, face tight but steady. They'd been through hard times before. But nothing like this. The riders slowed as they approached the property. Vance raised his hand, and his men spread out into a loose line. They were cautious, but not worried. Just men passing through land they figured belonged to nobody who mattered. Vance rode forward alone, stopping 20 feet from the porch. He was a big man, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. He looked Thomas over like he was counting the value of everything in sight. "Morning," Vance called out. His voice carried easy authority, the kind men follow into bad places. "This your ranch?" "It is." Thomas kept his hands visible, away from the rifle. "Seen any Apache through here? Or riders moving north?" "I've seen a lot of things lately." Thomas kept his voice level. "What's your business?" Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Territorial security. We're tracking outlaws, dangerous people." He gestured to his men. "Mind if we water our horses? Long ride ahead." Thomas knew this was the moment. Let them come in close. Let them relax, then spring the trap. But something in Vance's eyes made him think the man already suspected something. Maybe the ranch was too quiet. Maybe Thomas looked too tense. "Water's scarce," Thomas said. "Drought's been hard." "I can see that." Vance's hand drifted toward his belt. Not his gun, not yet, but close. "Still, we're government men. You're obliged to help." "I don't see any badges." Vance's smile disappeared. "Search the property," he told his men. That's when Sarah stepped out of the barn, rifle raised. Then the others appeared from the ravine, the rocks, every hidden position. 40 guns pointed at 12 men in the space of 3 seconds. "Put your hands up," Sarah said. Her voice cut through the morning like a blade. "Tell your men to drop their weapons." Vance stared at her. Thomas saw recognition flash across his face, then rage. "You," Vance said, "you're supposed to be dead." "Disappointed?" Sarah moved closer, rifle steady on his chest. "Drop the gun belt. Do it slow." Most of Vance's men were already reaching for the sky, reading the situation smart. But Vance and 3 others went for their guns instead. Thomas dove behind the porch rail as gunfire exploded across the ranch. Pete took the first shot, dropping one of Vance's men before the man cleared leather. Sarah fired twice, putting rounds into the dirt at Vance's horse's feet. The animal reared, throwing Vance backward. 2 more of Vance's men went down under fire from the ravine. The last one standing tried to run. He made it 10 feet before a bullet caught him in the leg and he went down screaming. Vance scrambled toward the wagon, blood running from where he'd hit the ground. He grabbed for a rifle in the wagon bed. Sarah shot him in the thigh. He collapsed, cursing, clutching his leg. The whole fight lasted maybe 90 seconds. Thomas stood up slowly, ears ringing. Pete had taken a bullet through his shoulder but was still upright, pressing his hand against the wound. 3 of Vance's men were dead. 5 were on their knees with their hands up. The rest were wounded but alive. Sarah walked to Vance, kicked his rifle away. "You're done," she said. Vance spat blood. "You think this ends anything? There's always another." "Shut up." Sarah turned to her people. "Check the wagon." They pulled back the canvas, moved the supply crates. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of bills, more money than Thomas had seen in his entire life. $50,000 meant for people dying in the drought, stolen and hidden while families lost everything. Thomas looked at Vance bleeding in the dirt and felt nothing. The first light came pale and cold across the flats. Thomas stood behind the water trough, rifle loaded, hands steady despite everything. Pete crouched near the barn door, his bandaged shoulder pressed against the wood. Around them, Sarah's people waited in positions they'd rehearsed through the night. Some in the hayloft, others behind the fence posts. A dozen more hidden in the ravine where the land dropped away to the east. Sarah knelt beside Thomas. She didn't speak, just checked her rifle one more time and watched the horizon. The dust appeared first, a thin line rising against the gray sky, moving north along the old cattle trail. Thomas counted the riders as they took shape. 12 men, 1 wagon pulled by 2 horses. They rode in a loose formation, confident, like men who owned whatever ground they crossed. "That's him," Sarah whispered. "Front rider, big man with the hat." Thomas saw him. Colonel Vance sat tall in his saddle, wearing a uniform jacket that might have been blue once, but had faded to something closer to ash. Even from a distance, Thomas could tell this was a man used to being obeyed. The riders slowed as they approached the ranch. Vance raised his hand, and the group stopped about 100 yards out. He said something to the men beside him. 2 riders broke off and started toward the house at a trot. "Scouts!" Sarah breathed. "Just like I thought." The 2 men rode closer. They looked young, maybe 20, hired guns with new revolvers and old confidence. They pulled up near the fence, eyes scanning the property. One of them called out, Anyone home? We're passing through, need to water the horses. Thomas stood up slowly, keeping his rifle low. Ranch is closed. Keep riding. The scout grinned. That's not friendly. Colonel just wants to water his animals. We'll be gone in 10 minutes. I said keep riding. The grin faded. The scout looked back toward Vance, uncertain now. That's when Sarah's people rose from their positions. 40 rifles appeared like they'd grown from the ground itself. The barn doors swung open. The hayloft suddenly bristled with gun barrels. The ravine came alive with fighters. The 2 scouts froze. Their horses shifted nervously beneath them. Vance saw it all happen. Thomas watched the colonel's face change, watched him process the trap he'd ridden into. For a moment, nobody moved. The morning hung silent except for the wind crossing the empty land. Then Vance drew his pistol. "Take them!" he shouted. Everything broke at once. The scouts wheeled their horses and bolted. Sarah's people opened fire. The 2 young men made it maybe 30 feet before the bullets found them. They fell hard, horses scattering. Vance's remaining men split into chaos. Some dove from their saddles, scrambling for cover that didn't exist. Others tried to charge forward, firing wild. 3 men turned their horses and ran south, back the way they'd come, but riders from the ravine cut them off. Thomas fired at a man rushing the porch, missed, fired again. The man went down clutching his leg. Pete shot from the barn doorway, his rifle cracking steady despite his wounded shoulder. Vance stayed mounted, firing his pistol toward the barn. He was shouting orders nobody followed. His wagon driver tried to turn the horses around, but Sarah put a bullet through the wagon wheel. The whole thing lurched sideways and stopped. A bearded man in a torn duster made it to the water trough, using it for cover. He fired 3 shots that splintered the porch rail near Thomas's head. Sarah shifted position and took him down with 1 clean shot. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, 8 of Vance's men lay dead or dying in the dirt. 3 had their hands up, kneeling in the dust. 1 man lay wounded by the overturned wagon, crying for water. Vance himself sat on his horse in the middle of it all, pistol empty, looking at 40 rifles pointed his direction. Blood ran down his leg from where a bullet had caught him above the knee. His face had gone white. Sarah walked forward, rifle aimed at his chest. "Get down." Vance didn't move. "You're making a mistake. I'm a federal officer." "You're a thief and a murderer," Sarah said. Her voice carried across the silent ranch. "And you're done. I'll see you all hang for this." Sarah shot his horse. The animal screamed and collapsed. Vance barely rolled clear before it hit the ground. He lay in the dirt, clutching his bleeding leg, hat gone, uniform covered in dust. Thomas walked over, rifle ready. He looked down at the man who'd stolen money meant to save ranches like his, who'd burned towns and killed families to hide what he'd done. "The marshal's already riding in," Thomas said. "Sarah sent word yesterday. This was all legal, witnessed. You're going to trial." Vance's face twisted. He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't hold him. He fell back, breathing hard, staring up at the people he'd hunted for 5 years. Sarah's fighters moved through the scene, checking bodies, disarming the survivors. Someone brought water for the wounded man by the wagon. Pete climbed down from the barn, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. Thomas looked at his ranch, bullet holes in the porch, blood in the dirt. 2 dead horses and 11 dead men scattered across land that used to grow things. But it was still his ranch, and he was still standing. The territorial marshal arrived 2 hours after the gunfire stopped. His name was Clayton Hayes, and he rode in with 4 deputies, all of them armed and cautious. They found Thomas sitting on his porch steps, rifle across his knees, watching Sarah's people tend to the wounded and secure the prisoners. Hayes dismounted slow, eyes scanning the bodies in the dirt. He'd been a marshal for 15 years. He'd seen range wars and ambushes and every kind of violence men could dream up. But this was different. This was organized. "Thomas Wade," he called out. Thomas stood. "That's me. Got a telegram yesterday from a woman named Sarah Bridger. Said there'd be a situation here requiring law enforcement." Hayes looked at the dead men, the overturned wagon, the kneeling prisoners. "Looks like she was right." Sarah walked over, rifle slung across her back. She'd washed the gun smoke off her face, but her hands still shook slightly. "Marshal Hayes, thank you for coming." Hayes studied her. "You're the one who sent word about Colonel Vance." "Former colonel," Sarah said. "Dishonorably discharged in '73. Been calling himself that ever since." Vance sat against the water trough, leg bandaged, hands tied. He tried to speak, but Hayes held up one hand. "I'll get to you." He turned back to Sarah. "Start from the beginning." She did. Told him about Texas, about the town Vance burned, about 5 years running. Told him about the drought relief money that never reached the ranchers who needed it. About tracking Vance for months. About Thomas sharing his water. About the choice to make a stand here. Hayes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he walked over to the wagon. His deputies had already pulled back the supply crates. Underneath sat 6 strong boxes, locks broken, filled with territorial currency. $50,000, one deputy said. Hayes looked at Vance. "That's government money, meant for drought relief." Vance's face had gone gray. "These people ambushed federal officers." "You're not a federal officer," Hayes said. "Haven't been for years. I checked." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a wire back from the territorial governor's office. They've been looking for this money since '78. And for you." Thomas watched Vance's expression change. Watched the man realize his lies had finally caught up. Hayes turned to his deputies. "Load the prisoners. We're taking them to Santa Fe for trial." He looked at Sarah. "You'll need to come testify, you and your people." "We'll be there," Sarah said. The deputies moved through the scene, documenting everything, taking statements. They wrapped the dead in canvas and loaded them onto a wagon Hayes had brought. The 3 surviving prisoners were shackled and mounted on horses, hands tied to saddle horns. Vance had to be lifted onto a horse. His leg wouldn't hold him. He looked at Thomas as they prepared to leave. "You made a mistake, rancher." Thomas met his eyes. "No, I made a choice. There's a difference." Hayes mounted his horse. "Thomas, the territorial government offers rewards for recovery of stolen funds. Substantial rewards. You and Miss Bridger will be hearing from them." After the marshal left, the ranch fell quiet. Sarah's people began cleaning up, repairing what could be fixed, burning what couldn't. Pete sat on the porch steps, arm in a sling, watching them work. Thomas found Sarah by the fence line, looking east toward the mesa where her people had hidden for 5 years. "It's over," he said. She nodded. "Doesn't feel real yet." "What will you do now?" "Buy land. Legal land, with papers and deeds. Somewhere north, maybe. Somewhere we can stop running." She looked at him. "What about you?" "Keep this place going. Drill a new well when the money comes through. Buy cattle. Wait for rain." He paused. "Could use some help if any of your people want to stay." Sarah smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her. "I'll ask." They stood there as the sun dropped lower, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. The land looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. The drought would break eventually. The bank would get paid. The ranch would survive. Thomas thought about his wife, about the life they'd planned here. She would have opened the gate for Sarah's people without hesitation, would have fed them, sheltered them, fought beside them. Maybe he'd finally learned what she always knew, that survival isn't about holding tight to what you have, It's about knowing when to open your hands and let something bigger in. Sarah's people secured the prisoners while Thomas stood in the settling dust, watching his ranch transform into something he barely recognized. The territorial marshal arrived 3 hours later with 6 deputies, their horses kicking up clouds as they rode in. Marshal Hewitt was an older man with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too many scenes like this one. He dismounted slowly, taking in the bodies, the blood, the overturned wagon. "Thomas Wade?" he asked. "That's right. Miss Bridger sent word 2 days back. Said there'd be a situation here." Hewitt walked toward Vance, who sat propped against a fence post, leg bandaged, hands bound. "Colonel Vance, been looking for you for a long time." Vance spat in the dirt. "These people ambushed federal officers." "You haven't been federal anything for 6 years," Hewitt said. "Not since you deserted after stealing that relief money." He turned to Sarah. "The wagon?" "Intact. Money's under the supply crates, just like we heard." The deputies moved in, checking the wagon, counting bodies, taking statements. Thomas told them everything. How Sarah arrived asking for water, how she'd explained about Vance, how they'd set the trap legally with the marshal's knowledge. Pete confirmed it all, arm in a sling now, face pale but steady. They found $50,000 in government-marked bags. Hewitt documented every bill, every witness, every detail. By sunset, Vance and his 3 surviving men were loaded into a prison wagon. The marshal promised a quick trial in the territorial capital. Before they left, Hewitt pulled Thomas aside. "The territorial governor authorized a recovery reward, 20% of what you helped get back. That's $10,000 split between you and Miss Bridger's people." Thomas had never heard numbers like that applied to his own life. $10,000. Enough to save the ranch 5 times over, enough to finally breathe. "There'll be paperwork," Hewitt continued. "But you did right here, both of you." The prison wagon rolled south with Vance inside, his face pressed against the bars, watching the ranch disappear. Sarah stood next to Thomas as they watched it go. "It's finished," she said. "For you, maybe. I've still got a ranch to rebuild." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Some of my people want to stay in the area, buy land if we can. Might need advice from someone who knows how to survive out here. I barely survived, but you did. That counts for something." The next weeks moved fast. The reward money came through official channels, documented and legal. Thomas paid off the bank with enough left over to drill a new well on the western section, where the ground stayed damp even in drought. He bought lumber to repair the bullet damage and hired 2 of Sarah's people who wanted steady work. A married couple named Ray and Catherine, who knew horses better than anyone Thomas had met. Pete's shoulder healed, crooked but functional. He stayed on as foreman, moving into the small house Thomas's wife had always wanted to build for hired help. They never talked much about the battle, but sometimes Thomas would catch Pete staring at the spots where men had fallen, and he knew they were both carrying the same weight. Sarah found land 40 miles north, a valley with a year-round creek and room for cattle. Her people pooled their reward money and bought it outright. No bank, no debt. Just clean ownership. They built houses and corrals, planted crops, started over with their real names, and no more running. The drought broke in October. Rain came heavy for 3 days straight, filling the empty creek beds, turning the brown grass green again. Thomas stood on his porch watching water run off the roof, thinking about how close he'd come to losing everything. But he hadn't lost it. He'd given away his last water to a stranger, and somehow that choice had saved him. Not because of destiny or fate, but because kindness creates debts that good people pay back. Sarah visited in November, riding up alone on a calm afternoon. They sat on the porch drinking coffee, 2 people who'd made their stand and survived it. "You ever regret it?" she asked. Letting us turn your ranch into a battlefield? Thomas considered the question. His land had been baptized in gunfire and blood. Men had died here, but he was still here, and so was his ranch, and the future looked possible again. No, he said, I don't.